Well, welcome back, everybody. And I'd like to take a moment real quickly and introduce James Campbell to you today. James and I have had some wonderful conversations, uh, bringing up some beautiful context because James works professionally in the human services field, serving as a licensed professional counselor and bringing in some wonderful context, as well as serving as an associate pastor in a local church context as well. So we're going to see both of those wonderful perspectives brought to the table here today, and we're going to do that. But without further ado, please, James, take the floor and lead us into your discussion. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to share a bit with you this morning, and I'm looking forward to the conversation continuing on this afternoon. First of all, as far as who I am and why I'm here, there are certainly things that I do, but what you do is not always exactly who you are. Your list of titles doesn't always tell people a lot about where your passions are, where your heart is. I do work with Southeast Addiction Technology Transfer Center, which means that basically we try to take evidence-based practice, what we know works with regard to addiction, and turn it into practice-based evidence, stuff people will actually use instead of it collecting dust in a 3-ring binder somewhere on somebody's shelf. Also, I have a heart for working with families and with young people, so I do a lot of work around that. I also am a minister, and so I've worked in that capacity for a long time, and I really enjoy that aspect of things as well. And the only way I keep my head straight is by being the same person everywhere I show up. So the way I talk to you today is the way that I talk when I do trainings, and is the way that I talk if I'm in a pulpit. To me, it's all the same. I just try to be the same person everywhere I show up. As far as what I hope we get to cover today, and I'm going to talk super fast at times. So if I start to sound like an auctioneer, or if you think I'm freestyling, I promise I'm not. And hopefully, if anything's not clear, you'll put that in the chat, and we can circle back around to it in terms of questions. But we're going to try to cover a lot of territory really quickly. We're going to discuss a little bit whether addiction is a disease. We're going to define recovery in a real basic terms. I'm never trying to make simple things complicated. I'm always trying to make complicated things simple. Explain medication-assisted recovery and some of the challenges around that, and then how can we support others wisely or in a healthy way. I always like to put this disclaimer in any of my trainings. Rome for a season was not a great empire because Rome was brilliant. Rome was a great empire for a season because they recognized brilliance and stole it regularly. So as I'm presenting today, if you hear me say anything at any point and you go, wow, that was brilliant, odds are pretty good that I stole it from somewhere, that I got it from someplace else. I'll try to footnote that to let you know I'm not trying to plagiarize anyone. But that's the whole point of having conversations like this, right? Is to learn from one another and to take the information and actually apply it and be able to use that as well. So why are we even having this conversation in some regards? I know we've alluded to that a little bit in terms of overdoses within proximity of our churches and congregations. We've talked a little bit about that, but I want to take a half a step back from that for a moment. According to the National Institutes of Health, it's estimated that 1 in 10 individuals will struggle with a non-alcohol substance use disorder at some point in their life, and that 1 in 4 are going to develop an alcohol use disorder at some point as well. Now, I'm sorry, 1 in 3 alcohol related. So when you put those together, what that means is that if you have 100 people in any place of worship, on average, 30 to 40 of them are going to struggle with a substance use disorder at some point in their life. That's within the walls of our congregation. So if we're talking about in reach, there are people who are struggling with this issue who are in our congregations currently. If you're talking about outreach, likewise, 30 to 40% of folks outside of the walls of our congregations are going to be struggling with this. So whether you're trying to edify and build up your faith community, or whether you're talking about reaching out and growing your faith community, to ignore this population is not only foolish from a numeric standpoint, it's discompassionate. It's not compassionate. So we want to make sure that we really are loving our neighbors well, and we'll talk a bit about that as we move forward. 2, one of the things that I often ask is if we ask the average person in our community to describe, quote, an addict to us, what are some of the things that they're likely to say? And you usually get a wide range of things. If you don't mind for just a second in the chat, just type down like 1 or 2 words, things that you might hear when you ask somebody. And I'm not talking about you. You're a well-informed, educated person on matters of addiction and recovery, but I'm talking about the person at the local grocery store. people at your family reunion, maybe folks who you're working and walking alongside every day. If you ask them to describe, quote, an addict, what would they tell you? Like, how do they look? How do they act? What do they do? What are some of the descriptions, if you don't mind putting those in the chat? Selfish, I see. Someone had put in, I certainly hear that. Loser, thief, can't trust them, abusers, thieves. Uh, I wouldn't know, we don't have any here. Yeah, I hear that one sometimes too. Most definitely. Uh, People might say a criminal, um, male, brown bag, disheveled, unkempt. Absolutely. You and I know some of the same people. You and I know some of the same people, because when I ask this question, I get a lot of those same answers. And the way I can prove that is true is I made this next slide before I asked you that question. When I talk to people about addiction, people have in their mind these sorts of images. Folks who maybe are struggling with mental health disorders as well. So maybe they're really thin, maybe they have poor oral hygiene, their teeth are messed up. Maybe it's criminal, maybe it's homelessness. So they have all these different views of what addiction is. The problem is that, does that describe most of us or most of our loved ones as we are now? And for most of us, the answer to that is no. And the problem is that as long as we believe that this is addiction, it keeps people who need help from coming in to get the help that they need, because these are not the symptoms of addiction. These are the stereotypes of addiction. Addiction is a brain disease. And to put that in like the most basic fundamental terms, health is basically you have an organ or organ system of the body. Now, I love biology because I believe that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I love it and can get lost in it. I won't do that to you this morning, I promise. Hours in a day, I won't go too far afield on that. But when you have health, you have an organ or organ system of the body is functioning well or functioning as it should, and good stuff happens. That's health. But when you have an organ or organ system of the body and it functions otherwise, then you have symptoms, you have dis-ease or disease. And for whatever reason, within the church and outside the walls of the church, one of the things I've noticed is that if I say something like the organ system of the body that's impacted is the heart, and if I say to you, my father had a heart attack the other night, people are so compassionate. They're like, oh my goodness, where I live, they say, bless your heart. They'll put you on a prayer chain. They'll bring you a casserole. It'll be full of butter and salt and cheese and might take you on out, but they'll bring you one, right? That's the reality. But if I say to somebody, wow, my father overdosed the other night, they might say, bless your heart. They're almost certainly not adding me to a prayer chain, and they're not going to be any casseroles coming for sure. What that means is that people, generally speaking, even people who say they see addiction as a disease, don't really treat it like one. They treat it as a moral failing. When the organ system that is impacted is the brain or the central nervous system, people get really squirrely about that in terms of thinking of things as a disease. That's true for both mental health stigma and for substance use disorder stigma as well. So most people would say they could develop a heart disease, particularly if I said, hey, if you had a biological history, a genetic history of people in your family having heart disease, if you eat 3 chili cheeseburgers a week and supersize it and, all that kind of stuff, could you develop heart disease? Most people go, yeah, I mean, if I did those things and I had that genetic makeup, yeah, I could develop heart disease. But if I say, well, what about if addiction ran in your family? Or what about if you used cocaine enough, or if you used alcohol enough, or if you used heroin enough? Could you become an addict? Could you become addicted? And they usually say, no, 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 no. And I say, why not? Well, because I'm not that kind of person. And I'm like, what kind of person are we talking about? Like, I thought we were talking about physiology, not about morality. And so that becomes a little bit of that discrepancy. Again, people would say, yeah, heart disease, yes, but mental health or alcohol and drug issues, no, that's just not me. So when we talk about a disease, they don't let me make it up, sadly. I have to actually research it and find it all out. And in terms of the American Medical Association, there are a few things that they say we have to have if something's going to be considered a disease. A cause, what made it happen, and we may or may not know that. Like when a disease first comes on the scene, sometimes we don't know what causes it yet. Symptoms, how do we know they've got it? A prognosis, what happens if it goes untreated? Or what happens with treatment? It may or may not have a treatment. That like when everything first started with COVID, we knew people were sick, but we didn't know quite what to do with that or how to help them get better yet. And it may be acute or it may be chronic. In other words, it may be like short term or it may be lifelong, depending on the disease. Oftentimes, in what I find within faith communities is there's a lot of conversation about choice and willpower. That bootstrap idea, you just pull yourself up by the bootstrap. When they're sick and tired of being sick and tired, they'll come in. You hear a lot of those kinds of things. Now, here I want to actually pause for a second. I actually think that choice and willpower get short shrift, and what I mean by that is choice and willpower are insufficient to sustain someone in their recovery. And the reason I say that is eventually your willpower is going to take a day off. You know what I mean? Like you're going to have a bad day, somebody's going to offend you, and your willpower is going to go out the window. We're not usually really good at being consistent, especially in early recovery. We're not real good at being consistent in terms of willpower, or our ability to make good choices is impaired in early recovery, right? However, no one has ever maintained their recovery without willpower. So a lot of times we downplay the role of willpower, but I would say it's an essential element. It's just an inadequate one by itself. So yes, there is that piece of that puzzle, but it is just a piece of the puzzle. When we talk about having a brain disease and we talk about willpower alone is not going to be sufficient to fix a disease. Oftentimes you will hear people say things like, well, just make up your mind. To which I say, if you eat a box of X-Lax and make up your mind you're not going to the bathroom, that's probably not going to go so great for you. So I would really encourage folks to not just immediately jump to that. So in the case of addiction, does it have a cause? And usually when you ask that question, you get to kind of two camps of people, right? You get the nature people and the nurture people. The nature people are people who are like, no, it's all genetic. It's in your genes. It's in your family line. It's generation to generation. Your nurture people it's all about how you're raised, your upbringing, all that kind of stuff. When I first got into the field, the nature people got on my nerves, to be honest with you. I know that's not biblical, but can we just be real? Those folks annoyed me. I came heavily from a nurture point of view, like, no, it's your upbringing. If you grow up in a household and you see dad, when he gets stressed out, go drink a beer at 12. When you get older and you get stressed out, you're like, oh, I know how to handle that. That tended to be more the lens I viewed it through. The problem is that I read a lot of research. And the research, time and time again, kept coming back to that genetic piece of the puzzle. The most compelling thing I read actually was a study from Oxford University where they took identical twins that were adopted at birth. These are people who never lived with their biological parent a day of their life. And if they had a father or mother, a biological parent, who struggled with addiction, they were 4 times more likely to struggle with addiction in their lifetime, even if they never lived with them a single day in their life. And that really bothers me because I hate when research contradicts what I want to believe. Now, I don't know if you've ever been there where you're arguing hard for a cause and you're losing, but you're not ready to give it up yet. I can confess in my marriage, I do that many times, where I'm losing a cause, but I still feel compelled to keep having that conversation. And that's sort of where I ended up with this. Why is it that I'm arguing so hard for nurture when the research clearly indicates that nature is a piece of the puzzle? And it didn't take me long to figure out the answer. It's because I have a daughter and I have a son. And addiction is rampant in my family. And if it's nurture, then maybe I can be a good enough father to outparent addiction. Maybe I can have an S on my chest for super dad, have the right moment, the right after school special conversation, and I can spare them a lot of pain and heartache. The reality is that although, yes, a healthy family and support and having a caregiver who loves you is important, the reality is that biologically, my children's deck is stacked against them. The dice are loaded, and if they roll those dice, eventually they are more likely to struggle with addiction as well. But that still doesn't get to the fundamental issue of what is the cause of addiction. The cause of addiction, the capital T cause of addiction, is use. You have never met anyone addicted to alcohol who did not use alcohol, and you've never met anyone addicted to heroin who did not use heroin. Anyone can become addicted to a substance if the dose and frequency are high enough and consistent enough. It's not nature or nurture, it's use. The number one predictor of whether someone's going to struggle with a substance use disorder is dose and frequency. And it impacts our brain. Again, the brain being the organ that's really impacted in addiction. And if nobody's ever told you about your brain, like I'm going to give you like the 10,000 foot flyby overview of it. Your brain makes up about 2% of your body weight. So if you weigh 150 pounds, your brain weighs about 3 pounds. If you weigh 200 pounds, your brain weighs about 4 pounds. But it burns about 25% of your caloric intake, the calories you ingest. About 25% are used by your brain. That makes it an incredibly expensive organ for your body to run. That's because it's critical to survival. Your brain's job is to help you survive and the species to continue, the human race to keep going, right? That's what it does. And it does that through two main systems. One is that limbic system, limbic cortex that you see kind of down in the middle with all the colors. And it does that by being the gas pedal of our brain. That's what gets us up off the couch and doing stuff that helps us to survive. So if we're hungry, it's the limbic cortex that tells us that. If we're thirsty, it's the limbic cortex that tells us that. If we have a desire to procreate and continue the species, it is the limbic cortex that tells us that. It is the gas pedal that gets us off the couch and helps us to survive in that way. The other is the prefrontal cortex, which is like just above the eyes and the forehead, and it is the brakes and steering. In other words, the gas gives us all this energy, but the brakes and steering decides which way we steer it, where we go with it, what we do with it, all those kinds of things. And it's how we interface with the world around us. It's how we use our senses that God gave us to be able to connect with the world and to really figure out everything from who has the best chicken sandwich in town to when you have to go to the restroom, which gas stations are okay to stop at and which ones you like, no, I'm good, I'll just hold it. It's how we learn everything that it is that we learn about the world around us. That limbic system also is how we connect with other human beings. And drugs, every drug of misuse impacts that limbic system. It dysregulates it. It impacts our ability not only with regard to craving, but also with regard to being able to connect with others around us in a healthy way. So that cause is use. Now, symptoms, some would say, haven't we already talked about symptoms? No. Again, these are not symptoms. These are stereotypes of addiction. This is a small percentage of people on one far continuum of substance use disorders. There are definitely people who fit this category, but they are the exception more so than they are the rule. When you actually look at the symptoms of addiction, you see things like tolerance. They got where they could use more to get the same effect, or if they use the same amount, they didn't feel anything. Or withdrawal, when they try to stop, they get sick, or they may shake depending on what they're using. And you can get deep into the woods of withdrawal. The shortest, simplest definition of withdrawal I can give you is whatever a substance does going into your system, it does the opposite when it leaves. So if you're up on methamphetamine for 3 days and you crash, what happens? You crash. You want to sleep for days. If you're on cocaine and you're feeling euphoric, 10 foot tall and bulletproof, what happens when it wears off? You got the cocaine blues, you're sad, you're depressed. Likewise, for any of the other substances, it's likewise. People who are going to withdrawal for opiates, painkillers, are going to experience pain as well. And it impacts other things like your nausea receptors, etc. So the problem is that when you look at those symptoms, things like, did I ever use more than I intended? Did I ever give up things that mattered to me in order to use? Those kinds of questions, those are kind of hard to spot. Unless you know the person really well, you're going to have a difficult time knowing whether or not that applies to them. The symptoms are really easy to spot. The end result is that people think that if they don't fit the stereotype, they don't need any help and support. There are a lot of people out there who are using, who are functionally getting by, like their day-to-day may not be blowing up around them yet. But the reality is that if they think that they don't need any help or could benefit from support, then they're probably going to eventually end up in a worse place where they really are going to lose some things that matter significantly to them. So that makes it a lot harder to spot somebody struggling with a substance use disorder, which is why in your particular faith community, you may have people who are sitting beside you in a pew or sitting beside you in a chair or in an aisle or on the floor. And you may have people who are sitting around you consistently and have no idea they're struggling with substance use. And unless our faith communities are safe places for them to talk about their struggle, the reality is we will never know until something does blow up. The family falls apart, they get fired from a job, all those kind of things that can indeed bring somebody to the point of reaching out and needing some additional help. the prognosis for addiction unchecked. Some of us grew up hearing, things like institutions and graveyards. I just have shortened that list over time. The prognosis for addiction, if recovery does not happen, is death. And the reason I don't even include institutions, et cetera, in that list anymore is I know too many people who go to institutions and continue to get high. Uh, it is possible to get drugs within jail, and it's possible to get drugs within facilities. And so the reality is just because someone goes to jail doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be in recovery. They may not be using as much, or they may be using something different. But the prognosis without ceasing is death. The way I put that sometimes is everyone who ever uses drugs eventually stops. I just want them to do it on this side of the dirt. I don't want it to end in a graveyard. And so in that regard, that informs a lot of my opinions that we'll talk about a little bit later on. And it's not just my opinion, it's really backed by research as well. Treatment. We said a disease may or may not have a treatment. Well, in our case, we're fortunate that addiction does have treatment, but I want to be super clear here. When I say treatment, I don't necessarily mean formal treatment. Some people need that. Some people need a medical detox. Some people need to go into an inpatient facility or outpatient treatment. But when I say treatment in this context, what I mean is anything that arrests the development and the progression of the disease. And that might include AA, it might include NA, it might include Celebrate Recovery, it might include Al-Anon, it might include advocacy groups like Faces and Voices of Recovery, it might include faith community. There are lots of forms of treatment, things that help people to stop or reduce their use. And all of those are worthy of consideration. They're also not mutually exclusive. I mentioned earlier that addiction is rampant in my family. I will use my sister as an example with her permission, but she struggled with addiction for decades. And in her case, what she always said is, Jesus saved my soul and NA saved my life. And so it's not always mutually exclusive. We're not in competition with the 12-step fellowship across town. In fact, when we partner with them, we actually can do better work together than either of us can do separately in many cases. So what is recovery? Again, you can make this really complicated. There's some great definitions that are really detailed that are wonderful. On like the SAMHSA website, there's different domains and color charts and all kinds of excellent things. But again, my job and my goal is to try to make complicated things simple. What I would say, and when we talk about recovery is the process of getting back or recovering whatever it is that we've lost because of the use. In that case, recovery may mean getting back a driver's license. Recovery may mean getting back custody of children. Recovery may mean getting back a career or getting back the ability to earn money for the family. Recovery may mean getting back one's self-respect or a sense of self-worth. Recovery may mean reconnecting with our faith community or reconnecting with our God. It may mean all of those things. And so in that regard, recovery is the process of just getting back the things that we lost, recovering what the drug stole and what the drug took from us. Now here I pose this question, like, how did Jesus heal people? And the answer is that if you've read much in scripture, there's not an easy answer to that. It almost seems random sometimes. Like this person he tells to go dip in a river, this person he tells to dip in a pool, this person he like spits and makes dirt and mud and puts it on their eyes. Like Jesus, sometimes people are just touching the hem of his garment while he passes. He's healing people using all of these different ways. And so my question is that if Jesus is our model, and for many of us on this conversation today, that is the case. If Jesus is our model and he didn't heal people in the same way every time, why would we assume that healing from addiction looks the same way all the time? It just doesn't make sense that we would approach it that way. There really are multiple pathways of recovery. That might be one of those that doesn't get a lot of talk sometimes is spontaneous recovery. That's where there are people who after 20 years of use one day wake up and go, you know what? I think I'll stop today. And they do. I don't understand that. To me, that's like a unicorn, but that's amazing. And it does happen. I've talked to people who that's been true in their life. Some people find their recovery through 12 steps, through NA, through AA, through Celebrate Recovery, through Smart Recovery. Again, a wide range of different support groups. Some find that through faith-based recovery. Whether that's through, I do know people who, as a spiritual experience, were delivered from their addiction, meaning that They went to a service, they were struggling, they were white knuckling it, they were barely hanging on, or in some cases were under the influence while they were there, and during that service were delivered from it. Again, that's not everybody's story, but I don't want to discredit anyone's path to recovery. Formal treatment is that for someone. There I put more a door than a path. Formal treatment is never recovery. It's just one door to get into the house of recovery. I don't want to confuse those two things, and we'll talk a bit more in a second. And medication assisted recovery is another form of recovery, another part of recovery for many people as well. Nobody has to have all of those things. Some people have multiple of those. Some people have one of those. Again, it varies pretty widely. But if Jesus didn't heal everybody in the same way, why would we think that we are going to guide somebody to be healed in the same way? And the temptation is, particularly if we're in recovery as well, we tend to tell people what we know works, and what we know works in many cases is our experience. The reality is our experience is powerful. I love like certified peer support specialists, love that. But the reality is that if we're not careful, we will give the impression that our way is the way. Our path to recovery is the only way to recovery. Here, I'm not talking about salvation. I'm talking about recovery from addiction. So I always like to just make that sermon or that discretion as well. So in terms of medication-assisted recovery, I'm actually going to do something for a moment that's a little bit risky, but we're going to take the chance. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, and so that you can hopefully see me a little bit better. And I'm going to show you something that's, like, to me, the easiest way in the world to explain medication-assisted treatment. It's simple and almost to the point of being, can that be it? Certainly there's more to it than this, but this is a good opening place. This is an extension cord, right? This is an extension cord. If you have opioid receptors or receptors in your brain for whether that's dopamine, whether that's for opioids, whether that's for whatever the neurotransmitters are, again, that's part of being fearfully and wonderfully made, and we all have them. Well, nothing happens on this receptor cell until something plugs into it, right? Nothing happens until something plugs into it. And those can be natural things. We have natural painkillers like endorphins. We have natural stimulants like dopamine. We have those different neurotransmitters, but when they plug into the slot, it activates it and something can then happen. Drugs likewise land on those receptor cells and basically are synthetic or artificial means of exciting them in major ways. It gives a rush of that neurotransmitter. In other words, in the case of, I don't want to get too confusing here, but I'll say in the case of like a SSRI for depression, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, it blocks the little vacuum that takes the unused serotonin back up into the cell and keeps it down between the cells so that it can absorb more quickly. Well, in the case of cocaine, it's a selective dopamine reuptake inhibitor. It keeps the dopamine down in the receptor cell by blocking the reuptake valve that goes back into the cell. Well, in the case of opioids, when you're talking medication-assisted treatment, you have, let's say this is heroin in this case, or it's OxyContin in this case. When that plugs into that receptor cell is when they get the high. What medication-assisted treatment does is it takes one of these little safety caps and puts it over the receptor cell, so that now when the other opioid tries to come in, it's already taken. It can't get in and can't activate in the same way. That's a real basic idea of how medication-assisted treatment works. It also has a much longer term. In other words, it's not a quick turnaround. It's not a flash of dopamine or a flash of an opioid and then done. It has a much slower progression, which means that people aren't chasing the high in the same way. They're not feeling compelled to rush out and do things that are more reckless or that may cause greater harm to them and their loved ones. Now, in the case of naloxone or Narcan, essentially what is happening is, let's say that this is, in this case, heroin, and it's plugged in, right? We're going to take our little medication-assisted treatment out. In this case, the heroin is going to plug in. What happens in the case of Narcan is that it actually has smaller molecules and a stronger pull to this receptor cell than the opioid does. And the end result is it comes in, works underneath the edges, and pops it off of the receptor cell. That's what it does. Now, I'm a realist, so I don't like just theory. I want to like be real with you. If you administer Narcan to somebody, when they wake up, they are not going to be happy to see you. You might want to duck, take a couple of steps back, because they just went from comfortably numb and blissfully somewhere else to now being in full-blown withdrawal in many cases. So they're not going to be real happy in the moment. But you know what? They're alive to be angry. They're alive to be angry. So I'm willing to make that trade-off. I'm willing to do that and entertain that. Sometimes you will also hear people say things like, how many times should we bring them back? I mean, my goodness, this is their fourth time getting Narcan this week. And my answer is always the same number of times that you would want them brought back if it was your son, if it was your daughter. How many times would you want them to be brought back and to be brought back basically to life from the overdose? One other footnote there, and then I will share the screen again and get that moving, is that depending on what they're using, it may require more than one dose of Narcan. What I mean here is, particularly if they're what we call goofballing or speedballing, if they're using stimulants with the opioids, which does give a different high, a stronger high, the reality is it may take more than one dose of Narcan to bring them back. So in other words, having a naloxone kit is an awesome start, but it's a start. You probably want more than one on hand. The reality is too, is that bad batches of drugs tend to travel together. And so having multiple doses on site is a good idea, particularly if you're deliberately, intentionally trying to serve this community and work with them in that community as well. It's incredibly important to have adequate stores on hand. And addiction may be chronic, or disease may be chronic. Well, in the case of addiction, if we ask if it's chronic, the answer is yes. And that doesn't mean that people don't get better. In fact, people do get better. It is this particular slide is actually physiological evidence of recovery happening. What you see in that top row across the top is a naive brain, somebody who hasn't used anything. More the reds and the warm colors are the more active areas. In this case, it's cocaine, but the same is true with opioids. At 2 weeks into recovery, what you see is that they're still, after 2 weeks of abstinence, their brains aren't back functioning as they would have been. At 4 months, they're still not back functioning like they would have been, but they are coming back. You start to see the reds and the yellows expanding. That is the brain healing. That is the brain getting better. That is physiological evidence that recovery happens. One of the reasons the faith community's involvement is so important to me from the clinical side, not just from my own service in the faith community side, is that we are treating a chronic condition in an acute setting. What that means is that people need supports far beyond their formal treatment program. They're going to need those community supports if they're going to be able to maintain their recovery. The way I put that sometimes is this: we have a word for people who are in recovery by themselves. It's high. That doesn't work. There's not recovery in isolation. We need other people. In fact, the very first thing that was ever called not good in all of the scriptures in Christian, Jewish, and Islamic scripture, the very first thing ever called not good in those scriptures was not sin, and it was not forbidden fruit, and it wasn't rebellion. The very first thing that was called not good even before sin was for man to dwell alone. So we need each other in terms of our recovery, and we need each other in terms of community and in terms of life. I'm going to skip. All right, I'm going to skip through these slides just in the interest of time. They will be included in the slide deck, and what I'm really demonstrating there is the fact that people having a relapse or recurrence is actually common. Now, sometimes I will hear people say that relapse is a part of recovery. That's not true, but relapse is a symptom of the disease. That's two different things. And it can be really discouraging when you see the numbers around relapse or recurrence. But when you look at that compared to other chronic conditions, what you see is it actually fits very well. When we think about chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and asthma, drug dependence actually has better outcomes than some, and it has about the same as others. So the problem is that we tend to think of it as we're going to send somebody to this 28-day program and then they're going to be fixed. It's all going to be better. The reality is that it doesn't really work in that way. So what do we do with that? Well, there's a few thoughts here. for us as pastors, as faith leaders, as people who are trying to make a difference in our community. First is love God well. Keep the main thing the main thing. We understand, and they're not trying to turn you into a human service agency. That's not the goal. But what we know is that if you love God well, you're also going to love people well. And loving people well means loving all people well. Those who struggle with substance use, those that struggle with process addictions, those that struggle with mental health disorders, those who struggle with any number of things, because we all are struggling with something. We're all trying to find our way and navigate life on life's terms and figure out how to survive. The third one is a really important one to me. Be aware of our scope. It's really important to me for a couple of reasons. Number one is I would not dream of telling somebody who went to their doctor and they have diabetes and they got put on glucophage. I'm not a doctor. I don't present myself as a doctor. So what I can tell you is that I would never look at somebody who's been prescribed glucophage for their diabetes and say to them, you know, I think you need to back off on your dose, or you don't need that medicine, man. You just need to pray more. I wouldn't say that to somebody with that medical condition. So why would I feel okay saying to somebody who has been medically prescribed medication assisted treatment, you don't need that stuff. You just need to pray more. You just need to get right with Jesus. You just need to try harder. You just need to blank, fill in the blank. That is not my scope of practice. I'm not a doctor. And so I'm not going to try to be. And I also like to point out to folks who are faith leaders that there is liability and culpability in doing that. What I mean is that if we stand up and tell somebody from a position of authority in a faith community, hey, you don't need that stuff, and they quit it, and they do have a relapse and they overdose and die. Number one is I now have to live with that. That's a father, that's a mother, that's a son, that's a daughter, that's a brother, that's a sister that is gone from this earth. The second thing is that I am also liable because I just gave advice that was outside of my scope of expertise and it ended badly, which opens up that faith community for lawsuits and all kinds of ruckus and harm as well. And so in that regard, what I say is that you probably want to point them back to the physician. If they're struggling, they don't think the dose is right, have you talked to your doctor about that? Is more of the direction to go. Don't forget the family. More often than not, in my world, sometimes it's the person coming up going, man, I'm struggling. But more often than not, it's, hey, can you talk to my brother? Can you talk to my sister? Can you talk to my uncle? Can you talk to my son? Oftentimes, it's the family that brings people to our attention. Well, the family has to heal as well. If somebody got cancer in your family and it's significant cancer, it's going to impact all the family members. Likewise, when someone has the disease of addiction, it impacts everybody in that family. Don't forget the community. Making sure that we are knowing the resources in our community is huge. Do you know what mutual aid meetings or 12-step meetings are in your area? Do you know which ones are open and closed? Do you know the difference between AA and NA? Do you know which ones might be okay with serving LGBTQ folks and which ones are not going to welcome them open arms? What we're trying to do is make sure that people are not re-stigmatizing or further stigmatizing people who are taking the courageous step of reaching out for help. And don't forget you. The reality is I talked a little bit about biology earlier. The most fundamental thing about biology is that you can only reproduce what you are. You can only reproduce what you are. 2 dogs can't make a cat. 2 cats can't make a giraffe. You can only reproduce what you are. That's true in terms of your faith community. We can't reproduce a faith in others that we don't have ourselves. So that goes for that as well. But in addition to that, if you're working with human beings and you are unhealthy, you're not going to be able to lead to someone to greater health than you possess. You can't do it. You can't lead someone to greater spiritual maturity than you have. So don't forget in the process of taking care of others that you also have to steal away, take some time for yourself sometimes, take a deep breath, spend some time in the Word, spend some time doing the things that rejuvenate you to take good care of yourself as well. As a friend of mine once put it, God calls those who will not work lazy. He calls those who will not rest disobedient. And so being mindful of that as well. I know we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but I know I'm at a time boundary and I don't want to take 1 minute's time from Dr. Monty Burks. He is a friend of mine and a colleague. I know he'll do a phenomenal job. I look forward to him being on in a moment. And my contact information is there. It'll also be in the slides when you get a copy of them. If I can help in any way, I'm certainly glad to do that. And I will now defer to Pastor Rhodes or to Dr. Burks.
James, thank you so much. What a profound articulation of all the wonderful information. And I'm very thankful that you took the time to bring the extension cord analogy, and I think that's a really powerful image. And we thank you and very much deeply appreciate you. And I agree with what you're sharing here as well. So again, for everybody that is participating, we are encouraging you to please place questions and comments in the chat. We're going to have a full hour of Q&A at the end, or to make this really applicable and action oriented. And so I'd really like to make sure that everyone who has questions can make sure they share those, and our whole panel is going to be involved here, and we're going to make some action at the end of this. But I do want to make some space for Dr. Burks here, but I think just a quick technical point, we're going to stop the recording and restart it so that we can separate the two segments. So let's go ahead and do that now.